were duly elected officials, and the killing of them was in retaliation of and to prevent them from carrying out their public duties.
And that's why, at the end of this case, you will have to find Dan White guilty of first-degree murder.
Thank you, counsel. You may have a seat. Would the defense like to give an opening statement at this time?
Yes, Your Honor, I would.
Proceed.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The prosecutor, Mr. Norman, has skillfully outlined certain of the facts that will come here in this trial that he will use to support his theory that Dan White had committed first-degree murder. The evidence will show, and it's not disputed, that Dan White did in fact kill the mayor and Harvey Milk. The tragedies of November 27th were supported by the evidence, and I'm not here to contest that. There's no question that that happened. The trial, then, you might ask, why is it necessary to have this trial? And the answer to that is simply not so much as to find out what happened on that day, but as to why that happened. And I think that once all these facts are presented, the charge of first-degree murder will not be supported, since that is not what happened here. A little bit about Dan White. He was a native of San Francisco. He went to high school here and was an athlete. He was an Army veteran and served in Vietnam until he was honorably discharged. He then came back here and joined the police force. He then moved on and he became a fireman. He took a short hiatus and then he returned to the police force once again. He was married. He had a child. Dan White was a good father. Dan White was a good husband. Dan White was a good policeman. Dan White was a good fireman. Good people, fine people, do not just kill people in cold blood. They do not premeditate and deliberate these type of killings. Perhaps there's a part that went unrecognized here, and unfortunately it was unrecognized until it was too late. And that is the fact that Dan White was suffering from a disease. It's a disease just like any other. Perhaps it's not as obvious as a broken leg or a broken arm, but it's still a disease, and that disease was depression. It's not just the type of feeling experienced when something happens and you become disheartened, a change of events leads to you feeling down. It's actually a physical, chemical change inside the body that occurs. Doctors here, of course, will corroborate with their testimony in great detail, and they'll testify in regards to the symptoms of depression. Basically, they entail radical changes in diet, low energy, sleeplessness, restlessness, lack of interest in hobbies, life, family, social activities, you name it. It can lead to bizarre behavior and withdrawal from duties. And these depressive episodes occurred in Dan's life ever since he was a young child and occurred in great frequency, but they went unrecognized. Dan White was an idealistic young man, working-class young man. He believed strongly in traditional American values of family and home. I think that he could be classified as rigidly moral, but above all, he was an honest man. Perhaps too fair and too honest to be on the Board of Supervisors here in San Francisco, at this time at least. He trusted people. He believed people when they said something. He believed that a man's word was his bond. This whole situation with the Board of Supervisors continued to worsen. As he went into the job, he would have periodic depressed episodes. Then, in the summer of 1978, he went into one of these depressive episodes. This led to the impulsive decision of his resignation from the board. He didn't consult anyone, none of his aides, none of his constituents, who he worked so hard to be elected to represent. He just went in, drew up his letter, and gave it to the mayor. Eventually, that episode continued to worsen, and not knowing if he was going to be reappointed or not, he cracked. He went to the city hall on that devastating day, and he shot the mayor. He then saw Harvey Milk, who he heard didn't want him back on the board. He shot Harvey Milk then. Given these facts, I believe that the theory of first-degree murder is simply not supported. I believe that you will agree mental illness and stress broke this man. He simply was desperate. He was at wit's end. And the result of this was the tragic killing on that day of November 27th. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Now, at this time, does the defense have any witnesses that they'd like to call?
Yes, I would like to call Dr. Blinder.
Okay, and I understand that Dr. Blinder's qualifications have been stipulated to.
Yes,
Okay.
Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Proceed.
Hello, Dr. Blinder. Is it true that you specialize in the diagnosis and treatment of depressive disorders and that you helped develop what's now the treatment of choice for manic depression disorder, which is lithium carbonate?
Yes, it is.
All right. Would you tell the jury White's psychiatric history that you have obtained?
Yes. In 76, White married a school teacher, and that he was somewhat indifferent, not about his wife, but because there was family pressure, and that this was just expected of him, and that whether he wanted to be free agent or single or not was he was going to get married and do the proper thing. A year later, they had their son in July, and he was never political, but in the summer of 77, Mr. White became increasingly aware of the difficulty in providing protection to citizens in the streets. And there were some other issues that he was concerned about, so he decided that he wanted to get himself into City Hall where he could do something about these problems. He realized now that the system of electing supervisors had changed, and that a mere 5,000 votes would put him in the office, and that he could do some good. However, he had no political base before he decided to run, and he just announced it to his wife. And due to his characteristics, he put everything he had into it, spent all of his savings, went heavily into debt. But he contacted 7,000 homes, 5,000 businesses, day in, day out, on foot, knocking on doors, and at the end of the campaign, confounded experts with a 2-to-1 victory margin. So this victory kind of served as a catalyst for the tragic events that occurred on November 27th, 1978.
All right, so then can you explain for me here what you feel would be relevant in order to the conclusions that you will ultimately make today?
Yes, I can. Mr. White has been in conflict his whole life. He wanted to do something, on one hand, he wanted to be something of a free spirit and follow his feelings, but at the same time, he was exquisitely sensitive to family and middle-class pressures. The second feature of Mr. White's personality that I think ultimately will prove important is his lack of close friendship of a confidant. He had a lot of friends, but Mr. White was always pleasant, but never let friends beyond a certain point. You could never get that close to him. And as he put it to me, I have a quote from Mr. White: "All my life I have been able to handle any problems myself. If the going got tough, I just dug in harder. I had been in stress before as a policeman and a soldier, but never broke. But I guess this time things just got too much for me."
So, in other words, the overall question of Mr. White's mental status is the fact that he has these depressive episodes, perhaps as many as half a dozen per year?
Yes, each lasting 4 to 5 days, often without any apparent trigger. During these spells, he'd become quite withdrawn, quite lethargic. He would retreat to his room, wouldn't come to the door, wouldn't answer the phone. He would call in sick, wouldn't even sleep with his wife. And during these periods, he found that he could not cope with people. He would avoid them. He would become argumentative. He didn't know what he was thinking, which is out of character because ordinarily he's always